You've had lectures now on some of the basic principles of ecology and how people study ecology. And you've also had them for the basic principles of evolution and how people study evolution. What I wanted to do in the final of these 3 introductory lectures about ecology and evolution was to use those concepts not just to understand the way the world is and how it came to be, but where it's going, which basically is thinking about various forms of global and other environmental change, including local, and attempting to understand how this will impact ecological processes and patterns, and the evolutionary dynamics of the organisms residing within these environments that are changing so dramatically because of human influences. So the lecture is divided into 2 parts. This first part is going to summarize examples of a whole series of various types of environmental influence, including various forms of global change. The second part of the lecture right after that is going to ask about how organisms are dealing with those changes, including through evolution. Let's start with, in this particular lecture, how global change is occurring or other forms of environmental change. Okay, so let's go through them. And in each case, what I want to do is I want to give a personal example that is trying to continue this sort of place-based personal connection to the research, then following that with sort of a general example from the literature that sort of talks about this as a general phenomenon across the globe. Okay, so let's start with habitat loss. So what you're looking at here is a drone video of our cabin in British Columbia, the same place I keep talking to you about. And it illustrates 2 forms of habitat loss and how they're affecting the environment. On the right-hand side of the river, you see a large meadow, and that meadow has cleared historically before we owned the cabin for use by growing hay for livestock and also for the grazing of horses. On the left side of the river, you see the tracks of roads, and the entire area is a different sort of forest landscape that reflects a logged landscape. So that was clear-cut logged. And we still remember to this day when we showed up at the cabin and saw the entire other side of the river had been logged. So forestry practices and agriculture have had effects very locally at our cabin in influencing habitat loss for organisms, and that is also true globally. So here's one of the sort of most poignant examples, and that's the island of Borneo in Southeast Asia, which is home to a series of really unique organisms, including the orangutan. And what you see is that palm plantations have dramatically increased in the recent years to harvest palm oil. Now, it's not just Southeast Asia, but also the Amazon. You see dramatic changes in forest cover as a result of logging and agriculture in the Amazon, including in the Atlantic forest on the lower right-hand side, which is an extremely unique ecosystem that is now almost entirely absent. And I've been there, and there are just little forest fragments that are left. Now, it might be tempting to suggest to these developing countries that you stop destroying your forest, but the reality is, of course, that we are destroying our own forests. It's just that we did it in the past. So if you take a look at British Columbia, my cabin would be north of this area here. You can see that there's really very little old growth forest left. It's all been logged to primarily for forest wood products. And that's not true just in British Columbia, but it's true across the entire globe. Here's a representation of what are current croplands in North America. So the light green here in this image are areas that are heavily used by crops. Okay, so habitat loss is one major environmental change that organisms might have to respond to. Another one would be that the organisms that persist in their natural environments are subject to extreme hunting and harvesting. My own personal experiences in Bristol Bay in Alaska, where I worked on a test fishery that was seeking to predict the number of sockeye salmon that were coming back into Bristol Bay of Alaska so that the seafood processors could prepare. Now, this is a huge industry. And here's a representation of the millions of fish, sockeye salmon, and other species of salmon harvested in Bristol Bay from 1975 to 2011. 30 million sockeye salmon will be killed in a given year. Now, this is true globally. So here's a representation of global fishing efforts in various different forms, including trawlers dragging on the bottom of the ocean, drift long lining, so they put out long lines with individual hooks coming off them that are baited, purse seines, or they scoop up bits of the ocean and usually forage fishes and then do them in a purse and pull them up, as well as other forms of fishing. So there's an incredible intensity of fishing across the globe that has led to, in some instances, dramatic overfishing of fish stocks. And here are some examples of that. Here are 4 different shark species that are clearly showing dramatic declines as a result of the harvesting of sharks, either incidentally as bycatch associated with the longline fisheries, or through shark fin fisheries and other fisheries that are targeting sharks. This, of course, is a potentially dramatic effect, just like when I talked in the Food Web lecture about these top keystone species like wolves that might be having top-down effects on entire ecosystems. The same is true for sharks, and they are dramatically declining across the globe. Now, my own personal example here, I have another demonstration locally, and that is this ash tree. So this ash tree was in my yard, and we cut it down last year because it had been infested by the emerald ash borer. Emerald ash borers that were destroying all the ashes in Montreal, which is an invasive species from Asia. I have other examples of invasive species that are having effects. I used to do some work in the Sacramento-San Joaquin Valley, which is Delta, which is right flowing into San Francisco Bay. And here are some colleagues that I worked with out of the University of California, Davis, and those are bass that they're showing there that we've caught while electrofishing in the Delta. Those are not native, and in fact, the vast majority of biomass of fishes in the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta are invasive species. So think about it globally. Here's one look at terrestrial invasive species. And the top panel is showing the number of species in different countries that are invasive, and the bottom panel is showing the number of invasive species per square kilometer. And these invasive species have all kinds of dramatic impacts on the local native species. This is true also in aquatic environments. Here's a representation of the number of impactful or harmful invasive alien species. So invasive species are also a huge form of global environmental change. Pollution is a dramatic effect as well, and there are many forms of pollution. Here are just some personal things that struck me as being particularly dramatic. When you think about plastic, we tend to think about big water bottles, but of course the action of waves and grinding on things will break that plastic down into smaller and smaller bits, generating microplastics, and then even smaller, generating nanoplastics. And here's a picture of a bunch of different little bits of microplastics and a larval fish in Hawaii. And on the other side here, you see a panel showing the amount of microplastics that are present in different river basins in the world. So for example, the larger circles represent 500,000 particles per meter squared in the sediments of rivers. And one of the biggest green circles is the St. Lawrence River flowing right by Montreal. Other cool, well, not cool, but other interesting and perhaps counterintuitive or at least not obvious forms of pollution. Here's one representation. The red shows areas of America, of the US, where you have particularly high levels in fresh water of a particular pollutant, and that is salt. Of course, salt pollution in fresh water tends to come primarily from salt that they spray on the roads to prevent ice from accumulating on roads and therefore crashes. And in some places, here is Ontario, you have such incredibly high levels of salt that it's approaching sea level. And this has dramatic negative effects on many organisms, especially amphibians. Other forms of pollution, you've probably heard about light pollution, but one thing you may not have thought about is noise pollution. So here's a representation in protected areas of the US of the amount of noise pollution. noise by airplanes flying over, which can be incredibly loud, noise from roads, which are often very close, or noise from various forms of industry or agriculture. And I introduced temperature in the introductory video in the context of the personal experience from our cabin of the spreading northward of forest pests that are no longer being killed by really cold winters. And if you look in this video, this drone video, you can see these bands of trees that are gray. And those are spruce trees that are all dying as a result of the spruce bark beetle. Now, it's no surprise, I'm sure, to you to know that temperatures are increasing. Here's a representation of deviations from sort of typical temperatures over the time period. In some places, particularly in the Arctic regions, you see very extreme temperature increases of more than a degree over that time period, a degree Fahrenheit per decade. But in other places, not so much, such as in the central US. This is a critical point, is that the changes in any sort of global disturbance, including temperature, are dramatically variable through time and through space. In my introductory video, I talked about this dramatic droughts that we had at my cabin in British Columbia, where the water was much lower than usual, which obviously has a really negative effect on aquatic organisms. But also I talked about how the trees during the drought periods had dropped a lot of their needles to the extent that you could see these massive gyres of needles floating on the water after the wind blew them into the stream. Really dry conditions can also increase the frequency of fires. And so I've had personal experience with that as well. So here's a video I took from my brother's house while we were having dinner in 2016 of a dramatic fire that was occurring just across the valley in the Napa Valley. These fires and drought conditions have been particularly dramatic in California. So you can see here between about 2015 and 2017, it had basically the longest extended drought that California has ever seen, at least in recorded history. Thinking more generally, these droughts also contribute to fires that are occurring in other places in the world. There's many reasons for those fires, but one of those is drought conditions in the Amazon, represented here as what's called the vapor pressure deficit. On the flip side, of course, you can have really, really wet conditions. And so in the video, I mentioned that I was sitting in my kayak in my yard because I'd experienced dramatic floods in 2019. And the same thing was true in 2017. I recorded a series of videos about dealing with the flood in 2019, and check it out.
I've made several videos about how to waterproof your house against a flood. Our second 100-year flood in 3 years. At the end of that video, I said, wish me luck, because the water's supposed to get higher, and indeed the water has gotten a lot higher. Despite all the efforts of a couple of our neighbors, things have not gone well for them. Kayak side view of the house and the neighbors in the neighborhood. Down to my last beer, which is really, really sad. Nobody wants to carry beer back since we can't drive onto the island.
Flood conditions were particularly dramatic in 2019 and 2017 as a result of a series of factors, including a large snowpack because of heavy precipitation in the winter, and also a lot of spring precipitation, as well as high water levels in the Great Lakes. Now, it's true basically generally that the level of sort of ground record-breaking precipitation events has been increasing globally, and part of that is a result of increasing in hurricanes, and indeed in recent years you see an increase in the most dramatic of hurricanes.
And I just want to close by briefly mentioning another form of global change that seems to be having massive effects on entire communities of organisms, and that is ocean acidification. Basically, increasing carbon dioxide in the atmosphere leads to increasing absorption of carbon dioxide into the water, in particular into the ocean. And then when you combine that with carbonate ions, that removes carbonate from the water. Now, organisms need carbonate in order to calcify elements of their skeleton or their shells. And so dramatically increasing ocean acidification seems to be having particularly dramatic effects, along with many other things like temperature, on corals, but also on pretty much anything that builds any sort of calcium structure or shell, such as gastropods or various mollusks.
Okay, so yeah, there's an insane amount of environmental change going on out there. It's particularly rapid and dramatic now because of all the things that humans are doing to the environment. So,
Now the question is, how are organisms responding to those changes, both in terms of their population dynamics and community structure, but also in terms of their evolution? And does that evolution feed back to influence those ecological dynamics? That's the subject of the next part of the lecture.